Good evening, everyone. This is Lauren Jensen, and I have the presentation for page 246, number 14. So, given the grid that's a 10 by 10 at the left, which is right here, find the 4 points that, when joined to make a horizontal rectangle, make a rectangle that is the closest approximation to a golden rectangle. Also, for a challenge, suppose that the rectangle can be tilted. So at first, when I was approaching this problem, I didn't realize that we had only the points on the grid to be used. So I had to muddle through that for a while. So to determine the possible horizontal rectangles, we need the ratio of length to width to be as close to phi as possible. So we're given a 10 by 10 grid. We have 100 possible ratios. So I set up a following spreadsheet where I divided the numbers between 1 and 10 by the other numbers of 1 to 10 to get my ratios, and begin to see a pattern where, if we're talking about phi and golden rectangles, that means we're talking about ratios that are corresponding to the Fibonacci numbers. So we have 4 Fibonacci numbers from the Fibonacci sequence that are less than 10 that are in our chart. And so I realized that these numbers would give us the best chance of a golden rectangle as their ratios are equal to phi. So I divided everything out and highlighted the numbers that are Fibonacci numbers, and in yellow found ratios of 1.5, 1.6 repeating, and one of the ones that was the closest, which is 1.6, which is close to 1.618. So that gave me a 5 by 8 rectangle. So the candidates were a 2 by 3, a 3 by 5, and a 5 by 8, which are all Fibonacci numbers. So the 1.5 and the 1.6 repeating were either too low or too high. So the only possible rectangle that comes the closest to phi is the 5 by 8 rectangle with a ratio of 1.6. So there's multiple amounts of 4 points that can fit on the grid. So what I did is I put a 5 by 8 rectangle on a grid, and no, this is not a square grid because I'm using software that is not to scale. It's not square. And I highlighted in these points that are in this rectangle are the possible points that A could be, the magenta for D, the yellow for B, and the orange for C, because I could move this rectangle around. And I wanted to animate it, but I couldn't get it to work. So I just showed that those would be the areas where the 4 points could occur. So that's what I came up with for a horizontal rectangle. So then the challenge was to see if a rectangle could be tilted. Well, I soon figured out that if we need a 5, I could use a triangle. Again, these are not square. So I put a 3, 4, 5 triangle in the upper left-hand corner and extended this out 8 units. So I have 5 units going this way, and I did measure these angles, and yes, they are 90 degrees, even though it doesn't look like it. And realized that 8 units out from this point would not fall on the grid. In fact, the next grid would be somewhere down here, but that makes the rectangle too long, and therefore we don't have the ratio. So I scratched this one. So then I went over to this one, and the only points that fall on a grid, of course, are a square. and so therefore we wouldn't have the rectangle. So tilting it did not help us at all. So in conclusion, we have a 5x8 rectangle that's the closest to the golden rectangle. Thank you and have a good evening.